Hi everyone, I'm Nikki Jovicic from LookUpStrata, and I'm speaking with Michael Ferrier from EYEON Strata today. So Michael contacted me a few weeks back concerned about the support provided to purchasers when they're buying particularly into a strata scheme in Australia. So firstly, Michael, welcome, and can you tell us how you fit into this conversation and where your concerns are coming from?
Hi, Nikki. Great to talk to you again. Look, yes, where I'm coming from with this is that for over 10 years, we've been doing inspection searches of strata records for the purpose of providing reports to property buyers, primarily, who are looking to buy into strata. And what we realised pretty early on was that the quality of the information that buyers were getting wasn't great. So we've worked quite hard to sort of provide information at the best quality as possible. But what we've seen over time is that there's a lot of poor information around. A lot of buyers don't understand strata, don't understand the information in a strata report. And in some states in Australia, a lot of people are not even getting a report. So yeah, I think there's a lot we can talk about in that area.
So you've mentioned, Michael, that purchasers are buying strata properties without any understanding of how strata works. So how can this be happening in Australia?
Well, I think it happens for a couple of reasons. I think, first of all, the way properties are sold in Australia, apartments are sold exactly the same way that houses are sold. So there's no real distinction. I think the main thing to remember when people are buying into strata is they're buying into a community. And that means it's a shared ownership situation. And that means shared obligations to pay for the maintenance and upkeep of the building, but also shared rights in terms of what happens at the building and how well it can be managed. Now, a lot of people don't understand this when they buy into strata. They're just buying a property. And so they don't really find out what that means, what strata means. And I think this can apply to people who've already lived in strata or owned in strata, but haven't really been engaged. They may not really understand it either. So I think it does happen a lot. And sometimes people who do get strata reports are doing so because they've been asked to by their conveyancer. And in a way, they're just ticking a box. So they get a report, think it gives them some sort of support or protection. It doesn't really. It's a lot of information about what's happening in the building, and they don't bother to understand it or simply don't have the time to understand it. And therefore they buy the property without really understanding the situation in the building they're buying into.
Okay, we would have to agree with that, definitely. So do you find that, I mean, lot owners think they're just buying that lot that they're buying, that there's a lack of understanding that they're actually purchasing? You mentioned that community, but even the common property, they're actually part owner in that common property and the maintenance of that common property.
Yeah, so I definitely think there's a lack of understanding about this. I remember years ago, we had this lady who was asking questions about a report. She said, so how do I get out of that? I don't really want to be involved in that. I just want to have my apartment. So can I just choose not to be part of that strata scheme? And so she thought that, yeah, that was an optional thing, rather than, look, this is the legal way you own the property, and you've got obligations associated with that.
Yeah, there's no opt-in.
No, there's no opt-in.
Or opt-out.
Opt-out, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So in many states, I know that sellers are required to provide documents to purchasers. So does the information that's provided contain enough detail to adequately inform the purchaser of what they're purchasing?
Well, I think the first thing to say is, yes, the situation varies from state to state, as with a lot of things in Australia. In New South Wales and Queensland and WA more recently, there have been, I think, well, in New South Wales, there's been a long-standing practice for people to get a strata report before they buy property, and similar in Queensland. WA's legislation changed fairly recently, and I think that we'll probably see a bit more of that type of report appearing. But in all states, there's a level of vendor disclosure required, and the amount of disclosure does vary. In states like Victoria, the ACT, and largely in WA, for example, buyers have traditionally just relied on that vendor disclosure documents. Now, the amount of documents that are disclosed is limited, they're not necessarily up to date. They could be up to 6 months old, depending on the state. And there's nobody to explain to them what the documents mean. So we're talking about lack of understanding. When you just get a bunch of documents without any sort of report that summarizes what that means and perhaps how they fit together, people have got less chance to understand the information. And I think just in relation to that, they think that their conveyancer will have looked at all this stuff and understand it and let them know if there's anything they should be concerned about. And that may be the case, but I think people would be surprised to hear that a lot of conveyancers probably don't really understand strata either, and it's not really their job. Their job is to help somebody to successfully transfer the title in the property, to convey the title to the new owner. It's not really their job, and they're not getting paid to explain strata to people. So there's a big risk there for people in thinking that, oh, there's documents there, so that must have been all checked, everything's okay. It's not really the case. Even with a strata report, just because you get a report doesn't mean that it's all okay. You need to understand what's happening. And that can be lots of things. It can be that the building might not have any money saved up for capital maintenance, for example. There may be legal issues going on. There may be defects in the building. All of these things that could exist within the records and be identifiable from them, they're just not aware of until all of a sudden they receive an advice that they've got a special levy to pay or something like that, and it's too late then.
That's it. And they don't know what the special levy is, and that could even have been something that they could have received.
Correct. That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you mentioned about receiving that report in lots of states and then not so much in other states. So that's all you need. You just need that report, or are there different levels of quality of reports that you can get, and what impact does that have on the purchaser?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think the reality with strata reports is that there's no regulation around them. There's no qualifications or experience mandated for people who do strata searches and prepare strata reports. So what we see is a lot of reports that are inaccurate or missing information or just plain wrong. And this is partly because most of the people, almost all of the people that do this work are single operators, and there's nobody really to check the work that they do. You need to understand that in a lot of buildings, strata records can be fairly complex. And in many cases, some cases, let's not say a lot of cases, but in some cases, these reports can run to 1,000 or 1,500 pages because there's lots of long reports, defect reports, or other types of reports about the building, engineering reports that are long and can indicate that there's ongoing issues in the building. But some of this information that buyers are getting isn't right. And what's worse than that, it's very hard for them to then get support to understand that information anyway, again, for the same problem, because an individual operator who's perhaps doing too many reports in a day doesn't have the time and perhaps doesn't have the incentive to provide follow-up service. They've got a fee for doing the report and they've moved on to the next one. And I think this is a big problem with strata reports generally, and therefore a big problem with the level of advice that people or support that people are getting when they're buying.
Okay, so the purchaser's mainly dealing with a real estate agent and a settlement agent, say, in that process.
Yes.
It sounds as if neither of those are required to disclose too much information about strata or spend too much time explaining the situation, or may not be aware fully of the situation anyway. So there's really nobody in that process automatically assigned to a purchaser to let them know what's happening.
That's correct. And now there'll be a lot of real estate agents that they're selling apartments, but they don't really understand strata either. We've had plenty of examples where we've had to explain to the selling agent what's happening in a building because there's some confusion about it. And as I mentioned before with settlement agents or conveyancers, that a lot of them don't necessarily understand strata either. And I know Amanda Farmer, for example, who's a strata lawyer who talks a lot about strata issues. She gets asked to speak at conveyancing conferences, and she said she's always amazed how little knowledge there is about strata amongst the attendees. So I think that you're right. Those two areas, the selling agent and the legal support that the buyer's getting, doesn't necessarily mean that they're getting information about strata. So where do they go? That's the real question. How do they find out? And that's a bit of a dilemma for a lot of buyers, particularly if they haven't got somebody who's done a strata report who they can try and contact to find out more. Yeah.
And I guess they don't necessarily know that that's even missing unless they've looked into it. They don't even know that they're missing some information.
No, they don't. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, it's how do you can make a confident decision simply because you don't know there's other information out there.
And the other thing too is we've quickly spoken about it previously before we jumped on the call, but there's a hot market in a lot of these states at the moment, in most of the states around Australia. So they go into, say, an auction situation, emotions are running high, they have to make what is a fairly quick decision.
Yes.
Now they might really love the building or love the view, and they're making the decision based on what they're seeing rather than any information that's in the background behind that.
Yeah, so I think that's very true. I mean, property generally is an emotional purchase, and I think there's good reasons for that. It's a big decision, and it's it's people's homes and all the rest of it. So there is a lot of emotion involved in it. It's a very stressful process as well. Because listing levels currently are low, and rental, for example, is difficult in most places, then people are saying, well, perhaps I should try to buy, and that then becomes competitive, and there's time pressures and all the rest of it. In some states like New South Wales and Victoria, where auctions are pretty common, then people have to have done their due diligence before the auction. How do they get that information? In New South Wales, where we primarily operate, then obviously what we try to do is engage the vendor and the selling agent to have a report available for buyers during the auction, and so they can access a report at a much lower cost. And if they, if they're dealing with us, then we would provide them with full support and explanation about what all that information means. And we think that's the most important part of the service that we provide. But this is an area where I think there's a lot of poor advice out there, or a lack of advice probably is a better word, in this area. So it's something that I don't know how you fix it, particularly in the states where you're just getting some document disclosure. But I think making potential buyers or people or owners who are perhaps thinking of moving in from one building to another to think about this stuff and be aware of it, because obviously your experience in one building may not be the same as another.
And we might expand on that a bit, Michael, because I mean, if you've lived in strata for say 5 years, how can you not be aware of what's happening and then go through? Are there situations where owners have lived in strata, they've really liked the experience, they might have complained a bit when the lift didn't work, or they've grumbled because their strata levies have gone up at some point, but they haven't really got involved past that point. They find that they've had a really great experience and they go, okay, well, let's move, we need to move suburbs, or we're looking at something different, but we love strata, so let's move into strata. Will they have the same experience in the next building as they had in that current building necessarily?
No, probably almost definitely not. So take the example of somebody who's been living in a relatively small building that it maybe doesn't even have a lift. It's simple. It's a brick building. It doesn't need painting. There's not much in the way of fire protection equipment required, and so on. It's a fairly simple process. They pay their levies. They perhaps never even have been to a meeting, and they perhaps don't even read the minutes, but they haven't had any issues. They think, well, let's go to a shinier, newer building that's got better facilities, perhaps a pool and what have you. And all of a sudden, they find that this building has got issues, defect issues, or fire safety issues, for example, and their experience is going to be much different and probably much worse. Now, I don't want to make it sound like a lot of buildings have issues, because there's a lot of great buildings out there, and look, apartment living is fantastic for a lot of people. But there are people out there, and there's been some high-profile cases around this where the experience that people had is terrible, and there are ways that you can check that out. So be aware of that if you're thinking about buying. If you do live in strata and you're thinking about moving to a new building, please be aware that what you're buying into may not be the same animal at all that you're currently living in.
And you and I recorded a video, I think it was about a year ago, Michael, and we might put a link to that in the notes for this session as well. Mm-hmm. It was called Risky Buildings and Building Defects, and it went into quite a bit of detail about what could happen if you do make that choice and you unfortunately pick the wrong building, and the way you mitigate from happening. I think we said in that video, before you buy in any building, make sure you watch this video, and it has had lots of views, so lots of people have engaged with it, and hopefully we've helped some people along the way. But would you like to give just a summary? I suggest that whoever's watching this video watches that other video as well, even if you're outside New South Wales, it's probably still applicable. But would you like to just give a quick summary of what could happen if you're a buyer? You just go through the normal buying processes. If you're buying a standalone Torrens title property, a house on a block, that's your experience. As far as you know, you're just buying property, and that's all there is to it. Everyone's given you the information. Surely everyone's looking out for your best interest, and here you are, and you've just purchased without looking into it in any depth. And what are some of the things that could go wrong?
So look, I think a lot of the focus has been around newer buildings, and certainly a lot of the issues that we see where there are massive ongoing problems are often in newer buildings, and people may have bought those buildings off the plan before they're even out of the ground, and of course they've bought it on the base of lovely projections and photos and all of that sort of stuff, and then they get into the building and find that there's a whole lot of things there that haven't been built very well. Now, there is a bit of a process for this, a common process for this. And what we see is that process is very dependent on the builder or developer, on how prepared they are to get things sorted out. Some builders, developers are better than others in terms of building the apartments, but also in terms of fixing the defects. Often that doesn't end happily, so the owners aren't happy, and so they finish up taking legal action. Gets very expensive. And then while there's insurance involved here as well, it often doesn't cover the cost. There may be a settlement. A settlement can either be an agreement to fix the defects, or sometimes it can be a monetary settlement. And that doesn't necessarily cover the cost to do all the rectification works, and so on. I think the most common problem we see is water penetration issues. So poorly sealed balconies, doors, windows, bathrooms, and so on. And they can be then, problems throughout a building. And as you can imagine, if you have to pull out all the bathrooms in an apartment building, imagine how disruptive, expensive, and time-consuming that is. And look, there's bad examples of people who it's taken 5 or 7 years of bad experience to sort the issues out. There are also going to be good buildings that are new. The other thing with older buildings is that sometimes there's a lot of upgrading that needs to be done, particularly, say, for example, for fire service type stuff, where buildings have got way behind in terms of their fire safety. Of course, this has become a higher profile with combustible cladding. It's another issue in newer buildings. So there's a range of issues there that people may or may not be aware of, but they can get a better understanding of how it relates to a particular building by being really aware of the strata information, asking questions, and pushing back a little bit sometimes to try and find out a bit more about what's going on. We've had a few customers, and I think this is something to think about, is that we've had a few customers who've been bold enough to go and knock on the door in the building and try and talk to other owners in a building they're interested in, to find out what their experiences is. And sometimes they can find out a lot of information just through that sort of due diligence, personal due diligence, that's not document related. The other thing that we sometimes say to people is, if you're going to a building to have a look at it because you're interested in buying into it, how does it look? Does it look good, or does it look a bit tired? And if it looks a bit tired, there's a clue there that maintenance may not be great. Why isn't maintenance great? Perhaps they don't have any money to do the maintenance, and so they keep pushing the maintenance back. So gradually the quality of that building will decline. And at some point, that's going to have an impact on values. It must. And so the investment that people are making can be affected by that over time. So there's a whole lot of, I can't remember what else we talked about in that video now, but I'm sure that those issues were some of them. And it would be great. I must watch it again myself, actually, just to refresh. But yes, so there's a whole lot of things that people can be thinking about in terms of the risk associated with a particular building. Yeah.
And it might actually save you money, mightn't it? I mean, if you go and get a report and you find that they haven't got any money in the sinking fund, then you can come back with a counter offer and go, look, I'm not offering what you're asking because we've had a look at the sinking or the capital works fund, and we've noticed that it is there's not enough money there, and we know that money will be raised in the future, and so that's money that the previous owner should have paid into. So I'm not paying that for them. So I'll offer you X amount instead. So it's a good negotiation tool.
It can be, yeah, where that's an option. I mean, obviously in an auction situation, that's not always an option, but it's always an option not to bid, or to bid to a certain level that might reflect that discount you're talking about. If somebody else wants to bid higher and they don't have the information you do, well, that's up to them. It's hard for people, though, to move on to the next potential property. They like this one, I want to get this one, and then they'll often downplay those negative issues because of the emotions we talked about before. And all I think I'm saying to people is, please be aware. Please don't just ignore this stuff, because it can be really important, not only in a financial sense, but in a enjoyment sense of the property that's going to be your home. You don't want a whole lot of disruption. You don't want situations where there's scaffolding around the building for 2 years, or there's jackhammers pulling up bathroom tiles for years as well. I mean, nobody wants that. No,
that's exactly right. Okay, well, I think that basically covers everything that we were wanting to present to everyone. So do the due diligence, go in with your eyes wide open, know exactly what you're purchasing, why you're purchasing it. I mean, even we haven't sort of looked at things like strata plans and where your boundaries are and what you're responsible for. And that's something else, and bylaws to find out. So there's lots of information there, and all of that, I guess, is disclosed when you're doing a report. So that the question is, if you've got concerns, Michael, how do you protect yourself from being in this situation? What's the best thing to do?
A bit of knowledge and understanding is the first thing. And so being aware of these issues, and so trying to think them through when you're coming into that buying decision is important. One of the things that I've offered before, and I'm happy to offer again today, is that if people are thinking about buying into strata and they've got strata information, perhaps a strata report or what have you, and they're confused and they'd like a second opinion, then they can contact us, and they can obviously say, look, I saw you on LookUpStrata with Nikki, and are you able to help me in the situation? If we can help, we will help, and we won't charge you anything, on the condition, of course, that you tell any family and friends that we were very helpful, and so that perhaps people may look to use our services when the right time comes. But we get a lot of joy out of actually helping people. It's the best part of what we do, is when we can actually help people make a decision and provide them valuable information. So that's a really important thing to do. So we're happy to do that. If you've got a strata report in New South Wales particularly, or WA, from somebody else, and you're unsure about what it's saying, then contact us again, send us the report, we'll have a look at it for you, and we'll give you some feedback, and perhaps help you understand the information better. So we're happy to do that, happy to offer it. And I think, as you know, I think what you guys do at LookUpStrata is fantastic. It's a great community that you've created around strata, and so we're happy to do our bit to support that community as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Michael. And we do appreciate you've always helped out our readers when we've received questions in as well. And that's been fantastic. And I know people have contacted you after other sessions that we've ran and you've been able to assist them. So we really do thank you for that. And thank you for the input. Now, the other thing we wanted to just ask at the end of this session too is you had a sort of a question or a call out to people out there. So would you like to let them know about that?
Definitely. So if you've bought into Strata, perhaps you did your due diligence, perhaps you didn't really, or perhaps there wasn't very much good information around, but you've had a bad experience, we'd really love to talk to you because we're interested to understand the range of experiences, what people's expectations were when they bought into a building and how that turned out into reality, because ultimately we'd like to see a better environment for this due diligence for Strata. And I think understanding or hearing people's stories is a great way for us to try and see where the opportunities to improve things can be. So yes, if you're an owner and you've had a bad experience with Strata, or perhaps you're an owner and you've had a really good experience and then a bad experience, or whatever it happens to be, please, it'd be great if you got in touch so we could have a chat.
All right, Michael, thank you so much for joining us again today. No doubt we'll talk to you again in the near future, and have a great day.
Thanks, Nikki.
Thank you.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
If you gained value from this video, please hit like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you're looking for information about parking, strata insurance, defects and more, head over to lookupstrata.com.au or sign up to our free weekly newsletter via the link in the description box below.